Welcome to the podcast Scattered, one person's search for the story behind scattered remains. My name is Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical anthropologist and archaeologist. In other words, I like dead people. In this podcast, I speak about the challenges of searching for, discovering, and recovering dispersed remains from outdoor contexts. I offer new perspectives and insights directly from the mouths of researchers, as well as experiences of people who search for remains. All of this aims to provide you with valuable and accessible information on a subject that isn't talked about, doesn't seem to be a priority, and that is very understudied. I hope you enjoy.
If you need me to stop, just ask me to stop and we'll redo it.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, so on today's episode, I am welcoming Christine. And I'm just going to get you to introduce yourself because I want to make sure that your name is pronounced correctly and also where you are in your studies. So take it away, Christine. Who are you?
Okay, hi, my name's Christine Hymanyk. I am actually a Bachelor of Arts Anthropology student. I've been out of school for a couple of years now, but I'm basically just going back for a few classes so that I can try and get into grad school.
Woohoo! And you've been Pam Mayne Correia's student, haven't you?
Yes, indeed.
Oh, she's just awesome to work with. I love her to bits.
She is.
So what class of hers did you take?
I took it's one of those topics in biological anthropology classes, and this one was her chosen topic, and it was skeletal trauma. And at first, I didn't have a huge amount of information about what it was going to be, but because my interest is kind of in osteoarchaeology, osteology, things like that, I thought that it sounded like pretty much exactly the kind of thing I'd be interested in taking. And one thing is too, last time I was in school, I actually didn't get a chance to take any of Professor Mayne Correia's classes, and I was really looking forward to that opportunity. So, and it turns out that the skeletal trauma class was more of like a forensic perspective than I was actually expecting, but I was actually really quite pleasantly surprised by it. I really enjoyed it.
Funny how that happens. So you said that you've been out of school for a little bit. So just take me through your academic journey a little bit since you finished high school or, whenever you want to start and up to present, how it got you to where you are now.
Yeah, for sure. So I've always been really deeply interested in archaeology. That's always been something that I was interested in pursuing later on in my career ever since I was a child. And I do admit I watched bones on TV when I was a kid. So I was already very interested in anthropology in general. But when I went into university after high school, I sort of started to see what it was actually about. And I found out that the actuality of the field is actually something I like a lot more. I do still have that interest in archaeology, but I do think it shifted a little bit more when I learned about osteoarchaeology and bioarchaeology. I just think there's something very, very interesting about being able to sort of place a person in their own time and in their own place, just using like the human remains that are left over. And that really became sort of what I decided I wanted to continue on in my career. So I was out of school for a little while, but I'm back now. And my goal is definitely to get into grad school if possible.
Cool. So just for listeners, to make sure everybody understands, osteology is the study of bones. Osteo is bone. So for anybody listening, osteology is the study of bones. So when we talk about osteoarchaeology, we're talking about essentially bone archaeology. Where are you looking at for grad school and with whom?
I'm still kind of browsing around, but I'd very, very much like something that is more focused on just in general looking at populations, individuals from the past through their bones. So it gives like a pretty broad spectrum, but I do tend to be interested in things like dietary reconstruction. I've taken a few classes in things like paleopathologies and stuff like that. So just basically anything that you can glean from the remains. I have not as much of a math head, but I do like the isotopes as well, because I think you can get a lot of really valuable information out of those.
I was going to ask you about that. That seems to kind of be the dividing line with biological anthropologists, is whether you're dealing with the chemistry and looking through a microscope, or whether you're handling sort of the macroscopic and everything that you can hold in your hand.
Yeah, exactly. And I find there's a lot more of the sort of macroscopic discussion in forensics, but there's a fair amount of like the bone chemical sort of information you have to be up to date on as well. So honestly, as soon as you start dealing with bones, you're going to be dealing with at least a little bit of science. So you have to be prepared for it.
Oh, come on. It's all science. What are you talking about?
But haven't you heard? It's a soft science.
It's a science. Come on. All right. So let's dig into this paper that you wrote. So for our listeners, the reason Christine and I kind of contacted is obviously through Pam Mayne Correia, who I did another podcast episode with. And Christine wrote a paper for Pam's class on skeletal trauma. And she was looking at scavenger marks or trauma on skeletal remains from, correct me if I'm wrong, domestic dogs versus coyotes.
Yes, that was the goal of the experiment.
So not scattering per se, and not scavenging per se, but the marks on the bone to see if you could see if there was a difference between the scavenging of domestic dogs and the scavenging of coyotes or whatever else came along. Correct?
Yes, exactly.
All right. My work here is done then. I've summarized your paper.
I mostly wanted a domestic dog versus a wild, like, relative. And I thought that, like, I'm not getting wolves. I'm not probably going to get a lot of different things, but coyotes, I figured, were a pretty safe bet just because they're such common scavengers around here. So that was kind of the basis for that idea there.
All right. So this experiment, because you actually did a field experiment to test this out. And it took place outside of Edmonton, east of Edmonton.
Yeah.
In Alberta.
Mm-hmm.
And so walk me through how you wanted to, essentially your research design, how you wanted to investigate and gather evidence to see if there was a difference in skeletal trauma.
Okay. So developing my actual idea for this design, for the experimental design I ended up going with, was actually something that took me a little while to come up with. I knew from basically as soon as Professor Mayne Correia introduced this assignment that I'd want to do it on animal scavenging, because it's kind of like in both forensic anthropology and in biological anthropology, more like the bioarchaeology, there's something called site taphonomy. And just, you can explain if you want, but site taphonomy is basically the processes that make a site what we can see today. And those can be environmental, those can be human, those can be animals, it can be any number of things. But because site taphonomy is something that's important in both of those, I liked the fact that it was kind of like a middle ground between what we were doing in forensics and between what I kind of wanted to do in a future career. So I had already decided on animal scavenging being my idea. And at first, honestly, the first idea that came to me was mostly just, I know someone who has dogs. I could look at a bone that a dog has chewed, and maybe then I can just kind of do like a qualitative analysis of it. But Professor Mayne Correia actually suggested, why don't you do a comparison? You could contact the zoo and see if maybe like you could get a bone sample that was chewed on by an animal from the zoo. And for a while I was considering doing that, but after I started doing a little bit more research onto the topic, I realized that one thing that a number of different researchers have realized is that there do seem to be actual differences between the behaviors and the patterns that you'll see reflected in scavenging when it's done by a captive animal versus a wild animal. So even if you have two identical, like two animals of the same species, so like two wolves, if one of them's captive and one of them's wild, then they do sometimes exhibit different behaviors in how they'll scavenge things. So that's what basically started to give me the idea of maybe I should actually use real wild animals for this experiment instead of captive wild animals. So with that in mind, the design I came up with, there were a couple of problems to work out in advance because I knew that as a wild animal, I wouldn't really be able to have any control over what it was doing. And I probably shouldn't, for just out of concern that it might interfere with the results of my experiment. So just so to try and get a bone back that I could actually analyze, I decided that I would tie them to trees.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, you've brought up so many points that, I mean, I'm glad that you came across them and you realized them as significant concerns in a research design. Like, for instance, captive versus wild animals will differ in their behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and that will affect what you see on the bones.
Yeah, actually, there are a couple of papers that I was looking at that talk about, and actually even Lewis Binford's book, which is the one that first describes some of the signs that you might see on animal like scavenged bones, discuss the fact that an animal who's captive or is domesticated might chew bones more thoroughly than those out in the wild, just because they kind of have the time to do so. It's possible that they're bored in their surroundings. They don't really have anywhere else to go or anything better to do. So they might worry at the bones a little longer. So that was definitely a concern, yes.
And also the fact that you wanted to make it as naturalistic as possible with the awareness that anything that you introduce may adversely impact or alter the scavenger's behavior and therefore the trauma that you wanted to see on the bones.
Exactly, yes.
And that's, hands down something that I deal with in researching scattered and scavenged remains is that, yeah, you want it to be as naturalistic as possible, but you never know what you're going to get because you're just kind of leaving it to nature.
Exactly.
And so you could end up losing an entire experiment.
That happened a couple of times.
Or you could get these results that you just aren't able to replicate because nature changes daily. And just because it happened, on April 21st in 2020 doesn't mean it's going to happen exactly that way on April 21st in 2021 or 2022 or 10 years in the future. You never know what you're going to get.
There were a lot of different things that I was thinking of even while I was doing the experiment, like the period of time that I put it out. I ran the experiment 3 times over the course of basically like October to November, just late October to early November. And one thing, since it's already getting a little bit late in the year there, you're not seeing a lot of insect activity that you might be seeing later on. 2, your bones are probably going to be freezing at least overnight, which means that the decay is going to be a lot slower. I was not sure if that would affect how quickly the animals would notice that I had put something out there. And I was also noticing as well that while interestingly, just because it was November, we actually transitioned over into hunting season at the same time. And I wasn't sure if that would actually have an impact on what kind of animals would be appearing at the site, or if they would be appearing more regularly, or maybe even less if they were hiding from hunters. So there's a lot of different factors to consider. And if I would have run this experiment at a completely different time of the year, then even if I pretty much had every other detail down exactly, it would have probably been completely different.
So let's go through the details of how you set this up. So you said you did it, 3 times, mostly from necessity, but we can get through that. So you said that you tied up bones. So why did you choose just to use bones rather than, I don't know, something fleshed?
Honestly, the bones were slightly fleshed. So I thought it was kind of a good comparison. I also didn't want to put too much flesh to detract from the bones, because seeing the marks on the bones was kind of the main purpose. Another reason is just student budget. I could actually get the bones. I used pet chew bones. They're raw cow ribs that you can buy at pet supply stores, and they were very, very economical to buy that way. So that was another consideration, doing this on a student budget. Of course, if I ever did want to expand the research, then definitely looking into a more fleshed bone or possibly even a whole animal corpse would definitely be something I'd look into, just because there are a number of other sort of angles that you can look at the experiment with that way. And if I had hundreds of bones, say, then there would be a much higher chance of actually retrieving one.
Okay, so just so that we're clear, you did not use human bones, you did not use pig bones. You used pet supply bones that you bought from the pet store, which were cow
unprocessed cow ribs.
Unprocessed cow ribs. Okay, just so that we're crystal clear on that one.
I was wondering if I would have to clarify that at any point. We definitely weren't permitted in this class to do anything that would bring us up in front of an ethics review.
Nobody wants to be in front of an ethics review.
No, they didn't mean that when they said procure your own bones for this experiment.
All right. And so you had to tie up the bones. Was that something that you decided right from the outset, or is that something that you learned?
That was something I did decide from the outset. I honestly the person in me who wants everything to be okay, I can scientifically explain why I'm doing this, was still kind of shaking my head at why I'm tying bones into the trees. But really it was mostly just because a major aim of this assignment wasn't just to be able to see the animals be eating the bones. I wanted to actually retrieve the bones. So I thought that possibly tying them down, making them difficult to remove from my sight in some way, would be about the only deterrent I had from animals just taking the bones with them after they find them for the first time. And honestly, to a certain extent, it worked fairly well. At least for a couple of days in some cases, a bone managed to stay in the site for a little while, but in most cases, they did eventually get carried off anyways.
And you also used cameras.
Yes, I was lucky enough to be able to borrow a trail camera from my dad. And that honestly, that was kind of the linchpin of this experiment, because I had so much trouble retrieving a bone after it had been scavenged. I was still able to make use of a lot of photographs of animals as they stole my experiment. The camera that I used, it's one that works in low light conditions as well as good, decent light conditions, which was really valuable because a lot of activity was at night. But it basically takes 3 pictures in a short burst as soon as it detects movement. And then as long as it continues detecting movement after that, it'll wait 30 seconds and then take another burst of 3 photos. And the thing that's really useful about that as well is that each photo is time-stamped. So I actually not only knew which animals were at the site and kind of a general idea of what they were doing, but I also knew when it was and how long they stayed. So that was actually very, very useful information in the end. So in a lot of ways, I think this experiment wouldn't have even been as satisfying as it was if I hadn't had access to that.
Cool, but you still had to redo your experiment because bones kept disappearing, correct?
Yes, indeed. And going back through the camera card was really exciting. One detriment to using the camera was that while technically speaking, I could use it to sort of reconstruct what happened at the scene, I didn't get really current updates on what was happening. The pictures were all recorded in a card in the camera, and I would have to go physically to the site and retrieve it in order to see the pictures. And as we know, since we're baiting wild animals here, you don't necessarily want to just make too many trips suddenly appearing at a place where we know that wild animals have probably been congregating for quite a while. And you also don't necessarily want to go because you want the experiment to play out without your interference as much as possible. So it meant that I wasn't checking the card probably as often as would have been really appropriate in hindsight. But it was very interesting to come back to the site, find nothing there, and find hundreds and hundreds of pictures on the camera card to go through.
Sometimes with nothing in the pictures.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes the lighting wasn't very good. But sometimes it was good enough that you could at least see what was there. And honestly, sometimes you got some very, very good pictures.
Mm. Yeah, your one of the moose was fantastic.
Yeah, and there's like at least, I don't know, I think like 7 or 8 like it. He stuck around for a little while.
Oh, excuse me. Okay, so you tied up bones. Bones kept disappearing. You had photos.
Yep.
And you did manage to get some results. Some bones either stayed tied or you were able to retrieve the bones, and you had pictures that showed
Mhm.
who was visiting the bones or perhaps even scavenging, because that was the other thing, is linking up the scavengers that showed, or the animals that showed on your pictures, to what actually scavenged or made trauma on the bones.
Exactly, yeah.
So that would have been a bit of a trick. So what did you find?
Okay. So, as I said before, I had to repeat this experiment 3 times. The first time was kind of a little bit of a write-off because it ended up actually being accidentally scavenged by domestic dogs. And I already had my samples from domestic dogs, so I didn't need those. The second run of the experiment was probably the most active in terms of animal activity, and it was definitely the one that was out the longest. But it wasn't actually until the third trial that I actually managed to get a bone that I could retrieve. And out of the 2 that I had put out at the time, one of them had gone missing over the course of less than 2 days. So that kind of gave an idea of, okay, maybe it's time to bring it in. Also, my assignment was due pretty soon, so I wasn't really able to continue too much after that. The one that I managed to retrieve, to the best of my knowledge, the only thing that actually scavenged on this one was magpies. And it's kind of interesting. Like you can see, I took some pictures and did some analysis of the bone. You can definitely see a very, very pitted sort of surface on the bone that looks like something's been pecking at it. Definitely prioritization of the meat over the bone itself. And just sort of not like the kind of tooth marks that you'd see from a canid, obviously. But interestingly, the other bone from those 2 that were set out at the same time was stolen whole by a fisher, which when I saw pictures of it in the camera, I actually didn't recognize what kind of animal it was. So I had to look it up. And I just thought that was very interesting. The fact that an animal I don't really even usually associate with being around here was actually responsible for a very, very neat little scavenging escapade. He probably managed to chew through that rope in less than the amount of time it took to get a second burst of pictures. So probably about 30 seconds or so.
He was motivated.
He was, yeah. And now I can really understand why people are concerned about weasels and their chickens.
Oh yes. Oh yes. They're crafty, they're motivated, and they know what they want.
Exactly, yeah.
All
And
right. So
oh yeah,
sorry, I was just going to back up for a second. How many bones did you put out each time that you did this?
In each case, it was 2 at a time.
Okay.
So basically, that's a total of 6 bones that were put out in the forest over the course of that's about 3 weeks or so, more or less. And yeah, out of those 6, I only got 1 back.
Wow.
But
So
yeah,
the
as you were
scavengers
saying
were
before,
scattering
though,
the bones.
yeah, exactly. Some animals were very lucky for those couple of weeks. But as you were saying though, as well, like it's you can't ever predict what's going to happen exactly. Like I could run this experiment, maybe one more time and get exactly the results I'm looking for, or maybe I could run it 100 times and not get them. It's just basically luck of the draw. So there are a lot of different angles that you can approach it from, but that whole you can't really control your wild animals or you'll actually ruin the importance of the experiment in the first place is a really, really frustrating hurdle to try and get over.
But it's key too, because
Exactly.
I mean, that's the trick of it. If you want to be able to apply your results, which are naturalistic results, then you have to do the experiment in a naturalistic way.
Yeah, and already I was a little bit concerned about even just tying them up. But as we can see from my experiment, most animals didn't have too much trouble with that. So I was hoping that the effect, like the impact it would have on the site, is fairly limited.
So let's go over what you saw in the photos. So we've got a moose, a fisher, a magpie, probably other birds as well. What else did you see?
We had a number of deer, actually. And it was interesting because the deer and the moose, the fact that they showed up in those pictures and seemed to be sort of browsing around nearby, I wasn't sure if that actually meant they were scavenging too. Because one of the things I realized in my research is that apparently herbivores do actually sometimes at least chew on or consume bones. So that was something that I was actually aware of and looking for. It could have also just been a coincidence because of the proximity of where I set the experiment up to a number of game trails, but I thought it was interesting regardless. And one thing that was pretty exciting as well is that I actually had a bear visit the site.
Cool.
And one thing that was especially exciting was that the bear visited the site less than half an hour after the second set of bones had been put out. So we kind of get the sense that maybe he was watching as they were put out.
Maybe.
So yeah, that was pretty exciting. I got some very good pictures out of that, and I think that that actually prompted a little bit of reading into sort of bear scavenging patterns as well. And I believe that at least one of the bones was still left at the site even after the bear had been at it, which was very interesting because not the next day, but the day after, the bear actually came back and I think might have removed the second bone from the site at that time. So that was pretty interesting to see that he remembered apparently where he had eaten and remembered he had left something there.
And let's go check to see if it's still there.
Exactly, yeah. Of course, that really reaffirmed the importance of, being exceptionally careful out here, because at first, I guess I was concerned maybe I wouldn't get really any activity at all. As I had been saying before, I was concerned that the time of the year would mean that the bones would stay fresh longer, wouldn't necessarily smell as much, maybe be harder to detect. But it was really quite the opposite. You definitely have to be prepared for there to be animals there, because they did take notice very quickly in some cases.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make, is that, just because if we go walking out in the woods and we don't see anything, doesn't mean that nothing is there or nothing hadn't been or won't be there.
Mm-hmm.
We're just not seeing it, or we're not, aware of anything that might be lurking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's why I know Bear Safety 101 is basically never surprise them. Because if you make quite a bit of noise while you're going out through the forest, then they'll hear you coming. And the thing is, most animals probably won't bother with you, but it's when you surprise them or when you get between them and food that can be the problem. So that's why I had to be really
offspring.
Careful. Yeah, exactly. So I had to be very, very careful in this case.
Yeah, well, good for you for being careful, and I'm glad nothing happened, even though you found quite a bit out there, including a bear.
Yeah, like I was extremely surprised to see the bear in the pictures. I was like, oh my. I had been operating on the assumption that pretty much, we were both at Sherry Forbes' animal scavenging experiment that she did here in Edmonton. And in that experiment, I believe the only larger scavengers that visited the site were coyotes. So I think I was kind of almost, even though I knew I was using a different location for my experiment, I did, more or less think, well, maybe I'll just get coyotes. But I wouldn't even say that coyotes were necessarily the main scavenger that visited this site. So, be prepared for things you're not necessarily expecting.
Which is the beauty of working in nature.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's move on to what you discovered on the one bone that you found that was scavenged or affected by wild animals versus the ones that you had domestic dogs exposed to. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's difficult to really make a fair comparison with the bone that I retrieved from my wild experiment site versus the ones that the domestic dogs chewed, because they're very, very different animal, was scavenging in both cases. But in general, the results did more or less line up to what I was sort of expecting. The bones from the domestic dogs were very, very heavily processed. I could see like not just pits and like divots on the surface of the bone, like you might see if something was just gnawing on it. I saw huge punctures where the canines or carnassials had taken large amounts of the bone out of the thin portions of bone on the side, basically. I saw some, not furrows, but I did see some striations where a tooth would have sort of scratched across the surface of the bone. Whereas you didn't really notice much of that at all when the meat and basically just the leftover bits had been stripped off the wild one. It looked pretty unaffected by most things that had happened to it, which is unsurprising considering it was, I believe, just magpies in that case.
All right, but you said that you noticed pitting on the bone from where the magpies likely will have pecked the flesh off.
Mm-hmm. Just a little bit, though. It's not,
bit.
I don't think it is the kind of thing you would necessarily mistake for a canine tooth mark, but it is really kind of like, even though it might not really be a really good comparison to a domestic dog, it is really interesting to just see how that does appear on the bone, because I believe that if you're looking at a forensic case, then probably birds are a fairly considerable scavenger. So I haven't really read too much into bird scavenging. I was mostly focusing on canid. But I think that would be definitely another area of study that would probably be interesting.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So next steps, if you wanted to, just for your own purposes, if you wanted to repeat this experiment because you have access to the land
mm-hmm.
and you found an economical way to do it, you now have some insights, you've got a research design that, for the most part works.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to repeat, what would you do?
That really depends, actually. It's interesting you mentioned economical, because one of the things is if I was willing and able to sink considerable more funds into this, then I think I would like to try investing in a second or maybe even a third camera. It would be, I think, really interesting to be able to place cameras either around the site or at different locations, each with their own set of bones being put out. Just to kind of see, versus field or forest, who's more likely to show up in which location to get the bones. Also, in general, maybe a better trail camera, just because the one I had was fairly basic. And I think there are kinds that you can get that actually can send you pictures when it takes them. And if I had that kind of information, then I would know what the best time to retrieve the bones would be. It would limit the chances of me running into a bear at the site. And also I wouldn't have to go to check and risk sort of disrupting whatever is going on there in order to find out if it's time to take the bones or not. So those are a couple of things. Another thing I considered is honestly, putting out a whole animal corpse would probably be a really, really good sort of thing to look at, because one thing that comes up a lot in the research is not just in terms of like teeth marks and what you'd see on a single bone, but many animals actually scavenge very differently. One of the comparisons that I thought was especially interesting was between wolves and bears. And as I was saying, I was reading a little bit more into bears after one showed up at my site. Wolves apparently they do have a fairly predictable sort of way of disarticulating an animal corpse. Usually they'll go for the thoracic inlet and the face, parts like that, and not really show too much interest towards the vertebral column. Bears, I don't think have that kind of compunction quite as much. Another thing that was pretty interesting is that I don't believe canids are usually super associated with carrying off bones for very, very long distances. Usually they'll scavenge at the site and then leave, with some exceptions. But bears are much more likely to actually carry off big pieces. So I thought that would be actually an interesting thing to check to see if maybe do the coyotes actually treat the bodies differently than bears do? Is there a different order of operations when they're disarticulating animal remains? that kind of thing. And probably the other big one, I think, would probably be just setting the experiment the exact same way at different times of year, because I am pretty confident that if you did that just for maybe the course of 1 year, maybe try once every season, you'd probably see completely different results each time.
Yep. And that's something that I've always said, to anybody asking me, what happens, if would I see this? And I'm like, look, you can do this experiment for an entire lifetime, every single day, every year for a lifetime, in every location on the face of the planet, and get completely different results every day, everywhere.
Exactly. Yes. It makes it hard to find patterns, but if you're trying to get useful information, then that's just kind of the way it is.
And you got to start somewhere. I mean, that's what science is. You start somewhere, you make a hypothesis that you'll find this, you go out, you try it, you observe it, see what happens, and you replicate to see if you find a pattern.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Make sure your sample size is as big as possible. Only then can you start maybe putting together some consistencies.
That's just it. Sample size is not only in dates and locations, but also what you're putting out. Yeah. It's tough stuff, but we got to start somewhere, because there are questions. As you likely found out in Pam's classes, and coming out to the site with us, there's lots of questions. Law enforcement has questions. People who have had family members who have had people go missing, they have questions.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, when it's like, okay, we have animal or human remains that have been scavenged by an animal here, it's very, very unlikely we'll be able to just pull out a different body was actually, we did an experiment at this site. We did an experiment at this site at this exact same time of year last year, so we know exactly what kind of animals. No, that's never going to happen. But the more we can kind of do this experiment in different localities, the more that you can kind of put together that base of knowledge.
Exactly. So when you came out to the Edmonton dump site where we were, just for listeners, and I have other podcast episodes on this, we had put out a couple big pigs near a dump site within the city of Edmonton, city limits. And, much like Christine was talking about, we had cameras, we had tied up the pigs so that the scavengers were less likely to drag things off. And we just to see what scavengers showed up and what happened to the remains. And then after a couple months, so we set them out at the beginning of August. We went out at the beginning of, what was it? October.
It was October, I believe. Yes.
Yeah. So they were out there for a couple months, and we invited Pam and some of her students, and Christine was one of those people. So what did you learn during that?
Honestly, I think that sort of experience was what gave me the idea to see if I could get a camera for my experiment. I had actually thought it was really exciting, because I had thought from the beginning, I want to do animal scavenging. So having an opportunity to actually see actual researchers in the field doing the same kind of work that I was sort of planning on doing myself was really exciting. Honestly, I missed having access to a whole group of search and rescue people to try and find my bones after they got carried off. It would have been very helpful, I think, to have had a larger number of people when it came time to retrieve the bones. I had the help of my parents and their dogs as well to look for the bones, but we didn't really have any luck retrieving any after that. So it would have been actually very helpful, I think, to have had a larger number of people just to kind of scour the area. But yeah, no, it was really interesting to see. And it was one of the first things that actually gave me the idea that, okay, the location that just the small location that I decide to do the experiment in is probably going to be very important. Because I remember there were two different pigs that had been put out in that experiment. One of them had been in a more open sort of foresty area, and the other one had been in a more sheltered area near a bunch of animal paths. And I remember we noticed at the search that there was a lot more dispersal in the open site and a lot less dispersal on the in the site that was more sheltered. And the one that was more sheltered, actually, most of the dispersal had happened out onto the game trails. So that was another thing I was kind of really aware of when I picked a spot to put my own experiment. Just that it should probably be at the junction of game trails, and it should probably be a place that's kind of like enclosed and secure enough that any animals that appear there will be more likely to just stay and leave the remains there instead of carrying them off.
So the one bone that you managed to retrieve in your experiments, was it still tied up?
Yes, it was actually.
Okay. So it wasn't along a game trail or somewhere else?
No, that one was still tied in place.
Okay.
Mostly I just been thinking, well, even if they manage to get it off the rope, then technically speaking, maybe they'll still leave it somewhere nearby enough for me to find. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case in any of the other circumstances. So yes, the one bone that was retrieved had stayed tied the entire time.
Okay, cool. Good to know. Wow. So what's next in your future?
Honestly, I mentioned before grad school, I would be very, very interested in continuing a career in biological anthropology if I can. For this experiment in particular, kind of like, even though the paper is already done and marked and everything, the completionist in me might not settle if I never ever get to see a coyote chewed bone. So we'll see what happens there. I don't know if I'll necessarily, at least in the immediate future, have like a need to bust out this project for school, but it isn't like necessarily out of the question that I'd want to just pursue it for my own interest, honestly.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes when you
Yes.
start something, you just need to know.
Exactly. Like the fact that I'm just like thinking like, oh, it's so cheap to buy more bones. I know the people who live on this property. I do have to consider though the fact that like that my family lives on this property, and I don't necessarily want to be teaching the bears that there's always some delicious meat there. So that's another consideration, I guess.
It might be dangerous for your family to let out their dogs again.
Honestly, yeah. I was pretty careful choosing the site. I wanted to make sure that it was as far away from like where people live and where domesticated animals live as possible. But yeah, that was definitely a concern in the experiment, to the point where like I was actually surprised that my family was so excited about it with me. I had been expecting to have to try and convince them, like, okay, but this is for school. It's really important. Can you just let me borrow a corner of your property so that I can put some bones out on it? So I expected to have to really sell it to them. But my dad was actually super excited the whole time. So I was really lucky about that. And I don't necessarily want to lose that graciousness.
Keep the excitement, but lose the anxiety.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you had any tips, like if somebody, happened to either have property or have access to property and they wanted to run their own experiment, which is entirely possible, what would you recommend?
Okay, so this I actually gave some thought to in advance, just because, and actually I think I've kind of touched on some of these earlier on in this conversation as well. But in general, I'd say like, don't forget that if you're dealing with wild animals, you should definitely be very, very, very careful, overcautious if possible. I did not expect to get a bear at my site, and I did. And the fact that the bear was at the site so close to when humans were there means that like, I'm aware that things could have gone quite badly. So in general, I'd say don't set up or check the site alone. Make sure that you go with another person. Don't go quietly, so you'll end up like surprising anything or sneaking up on them, getting between them and their food. I actually ended up driving out to the site most days, just in case there was something big there. Yeah, and just don't set up the experiment too close to where you have humans living. And honestly, don't make it be something that there's always food there, because at a certain point you have to start thinking about, okay, why do they say not to feed wild animals? And you think, there might be something there. So in general, just remember that you're dealing with wild animals. Remember that you are putting yourself in a position of some danger and that you should be taking every precaution to make sure that you're being safe about it. It's really valuable data, but it's not worth being dead. So
absolutely. It's important research, but yeah, it's not worth dying over.
exactly. And also, I'll just say this as well. I was lucky in this case because not only did I have access to this land, but it's also an area that I was very familiar with. It's probably better to use an area that you're fairly familiar with in advance, just because it gives you an idea of what you might actually see there. So yeah, just in general, be careful, be cautious, make sure you know your area, and don't take any risks you don't need to.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much for joining me and answering all my questions. And do you know what? I really hope you do more of this and let me know about it, because, like we were discussing, this is valuable research and there's tons of work and potential that can come from this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will definitely let you know if I do decide to keep on doing it.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. I'll show you some more bear pictures.
Another Fisher picture, please.
Yes.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please leave a rating or review and share this episode and podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues.